Hey, Ben.
Hey, Steven, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, good.
Crazy week there.
Yeah. So, so you've been in that job for a couple of years, huh?
Yeah, I have. I started here in 2018, spring of 2018, so 3 years now.
Wow, great. How's it going?
Good, good. It's been a lot of fun. It's a good variety of work. There's a lot of different elements of the job between fundraising for land acquisition projects and getting out into the community for education events, and of course, there's always the administrative stuff in the office that comes along with the job. So,
Yeah.
but
Well,
it's
good. It seems like a great spot.
yeah, no, it is. It is nice to be close to the ocean.
It is. It always is. Yeah. And how have you guys been riding out the pandemic?
We've been doing okay. We're a small organization, so that made it easy to be able to safely return to the office. Months ago, there's only three of us here, max.
Right.
That's good. But how have things been up there, COVID wise? And
Well, we've been living on Islesboro Island out in the middle of Penobscot Bay
yeah, I know you mentioned that.
for the whole year, and that's worked out
Okay.
great. I went back for the capstone in the fall, and that felt edgy every time. And I kept that up for weeks and weeks, and we completed that class, but my spring has been all remote.
Okay.
And
Have
that's
you
been,
enjoyed that?
yeah, it's been all right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just slower. It's like slower and harder work, but
Right.
it also has some benefits. I mean, some students engage better, and it's interesting. It's different. It's definitely different. So,
Right. Yeah.
well, should we
Yeah.
test out? This looks pretty good. So usually what I do is you're the host, of course. You could co-host me, and then I could screen share. Should we give that a try right now?
Yeah. Why don't you do that? I think you have the ability to screen share already.
Okay. So just a second, let me get set up. The way I like to do it is with just a portion, and let me just get that set up. It probably doesn't look like much right now, just a second. Just looking for the presenter view, which is not coming through. Just a second.
Okay. No problem.
Let me just. So now when you're looking at it, I'll get this set up. You should be seeing just about my first, it's actually not my first slide at all.
Yeah, that looks good. I think we're seeing the whole.
And that should be now out to the edges. This slide is bled to the edge. And you should be seeing the title, the coral, this business. Do you see my cursor or not?
Yep.
Okay, great. And you see nothing over here?
When you hover over there, I do see like the next. I can see that. But
okay, perfect. Well, I think we're set up. This is how I've been doing it, because then I have the ability to see what's coming next in the presenter view, which is the way I like to run it. And if this fails, I'll go out of this and I'll go to full screen, and that always works.
Okay.
But this has been pretty solid, and you should be seeing then just me. And I was just tuning out the window a little bit there.
Yeah, no, that looks good. Your lighting is good.
Okay.
And we're hearing, I think, your kids in the background a little bit here and there.
Yeah. That's gonna end. They're headed downstairs for some pizza. Yeah, we have gotten used to dealing with that too.
I know we all have. We're all adjusting to these strange times.
And how's Elizabeth?
Good. She's very good.
Great.
Yeah, she is in nursing school right now. So.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It's a fabulous idea. I mean,
yeah.
Nursing, it seems like nursing is great enough, but then becoming a NP is even better.
Right.
So how did she get her nursing degree so quickly?
There's a Boston College program that's 2 years. And so in the first year, you actually become an RN at the end of the first year, and then the second year is that nurse practitioner degree. So
It's a great career.
yeah, I
I've
think
thought
it's
if I ever
secure.
give up being a professor, I would do that.
Yeah,
Like, it's a really, really good career. Like,
right.
you can go anywhere. It's interesting. It's well paid. It's honorable.
Mhm.
Like, the whole thing is good. So
Yeah, no, and there's a big variety of places you can work as well,
yeah,
whether it's a
yeah,
hospital setting or home care setting. Or,
yeah. Yeah, that seems like a really good one. So
yeah, well, I think it's been an interesting time for her to start getting that exposure as the healthcare world has been kind of turned on its head.
oh yeah. So she's been an RN during the whole crisis.
So she became an RN kind of in the middle of it. She
Really?
jumped right into a nursing home, and that was
Wow.
a tough experience. But
An RN in a nursing home.
yeah,
Huh.
so she's been working on the rehab floor there.
Oh, really? Must be a big nursing home to hire RNs for.
It is, yeah, it's good size. Well, there's a lot of old folks on the Cape, so
Yeah, same in Maine,
yeah,
same.
right.
So yeah, well, that sounds great. That sounds like good work and all useful. So I might so are you going to just use this same link for people to sign on to?
Yeah, we've actually we have a couple people who are listening in already,
Oh, okay.
but
Okay, great. I
just a
just put
couple
on
so
another
far.
light source because it gets dark where I am, and
Okay.
it's going to fade out. And how long do you want me to go?
If you can do a little under an hour, if that sounds good to you, and then take take some questions that will round out the hour,
I can go any
something
length of,
like that.
yeah. I feel like I can go any length of time.
I think I can see that.
Yeah, yeah. That's sometimes a problem, but when I run out of slides, I always manage to do fine. I have 46, it looks like,
Okay.
and they're really image heavy, and I cut out pretty much most of the science, and I'm focusing more on the issues and some things along those lines. So
Yeah. No, I think that's perfect.
okay, great. Well, I'm going to take a minute. Looks like we got a minute here. I'm going to take a minute just to get my water and things
Sure.
set up. But I'm ready to go anytime. And
Yeah, and then
I'll
I can't remember if I asked you, but is it okay if I record this and then paste it on our website?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely. No issues at all.
Excellent.
Um,
Thank you, Ben.
yep, no problem there. And I'm glad to do it. So there's someone who's apparently attending tonight who is the grandmother of one of my current students.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, she sent me an email today. Yeah, and I was like, wow, it's a small world. So
Yeah. Yeah, we had a Colby intern 2 summers ago now. So
great. Well, Colby's done well in this whole issue. They've gotten stunningly good press for dealing with it,
right.
and it's well deserved. They've done a good job actually of rallying up and spending the money when it had to be spent, and
Mhm.
they've really done a surprisingly good job. President Green got a 6-year extension on his contract, which
Wow, I
is
didn't know that.
no doubt related to this. And
Yeah. So
yeah,
that
so
was
it's
just recently.
it's definitely being moving up a tier in terms of small liberal arts colleges. So it's been a good place to be.
Yeah, no, it's been fun to kind of keep tabs and watch it grow and really get very competitive.
Yeah, no, it is. It really is. It's been well, and we've been lucky to live on the coast this year.
Right.
We're in a much smaller school. We had a big COVID scare like 2 weeks ago, and I
Mm.
thought, oh my gosh, close to the end. There were 2 cases, both in my daughter's classroom,
Sheesh.
and that's the first time it's come to the island where we're living. And I thought we might have been in it, but then we
Right.
weren't. We stayed in the house for 2 weeks, or I mean, on the property,
Mhm.
um, and did the right thing, and turned out okay. I got the shot 2 days ago, the
And no blood
Johnson and
clot yet.
Johnson, an hour before they shut it down, and I thought, oh
Oh,
my gosh, like that is a piece of bad luck right there.
right.
Um, I'm not too worried. It's a thin chance. I feel like they're doing the right thing, but it was one more level of like ironic stress I didn't quite need. So
Right. Right. I hear you.
well, good. Well, I'm gonna get set up,
Okay.
and I'm gonna leave this right as is in terms of the lighting. So great.
Excellent. Welcome everyone who is joining in. We'll start here in just a few minutes. And so Ben, what does spring break look like? Welcome everyone who is with us already. We'll give it just another minute or two here as people are signing on. Okay, well, why don't I kick us off and I'll start getting through some of the administrative stuff. So thank you everyone for joining this webinar this evening. I'm Steve O'Grady. I'm the Executive Director of the Orleans Conservation Trust. OCT is a nonprofit land trust founded in 1970. OCT has preserved over 640 acres, and we continue to acquire land by gift and purchase, all of which is preserved in perpetuity. We actively manage that land to improve wildlife habitat, create opportunities for public access and education. And we're also increasingly thinking about how we can manage our land to be more resilient in the face of climate change. We host monthly guided walks in Orleans, and we host this wonderful lecture series that you're about to listen in on. We have 2.5 full-time equivalent staff and a very engaged volunteer board of trustees. There are 13 trustees, and each one of them is a huge asset to our organization. As I mentioned, we're a nonprofit, and we do not receive any operating funds from the town government or any other government. So all of our work is made possible through the support and generosity of our membership. I'd like to quickly review the basics of how this webinar will work, although I know a lot of you are very used to these at this point, but as an attendee, your camera is off and can't be turned on. You'll be able to ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So please put your questions in the Q&A and not the chat, but you can use the chat as well if you would like for sharing information and things of that nature. So without further ado, I will introduce Ben. Benjamin Neal is a marine biologist who has studied coral reefs in many parts of the world. He was the leader of the Shallow Reef Survey team for the Catlin Seaview Survey and the Coral Reef Ecosystem Laboratory based at the University of Queensland in Australia. Ben received his PhD from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego, where he studied the ability of a coral reef to respond after a bleaching event. He's authored and co-authored numerous scientific papers ranging from thermal stress on coral reefs to the automation of processing of coral reef images to community supported fisheries. Ben is currently a professor of environmental studies at Colby College, where he's taught dating back to 2013, and that is where our paths crossed. As a former student, I can say that Ben inspires deep respect for the ocean and marine life and endless curiosity in his teaching. His classes were some of the most fascinating I've ever taken, so I was really glad when we were able to reel in Ben and get him to do this talk tonight. And I will very quickly tell a brief story here. I distinctly remember a time in one of Ben's classes when he was talking about his work doing this shallow water reef surveys, and he was tasked with manning this camera, a very high-tech camera, and Ben would scuba dive behind it and the camera would photograph coral reefs as he swam along and piloted the thing. And so he's doing this for hours on end and all kinds of cool stories of sharks and crazy marine life and hazards. But he did this for miles and said that he may have seen more coral reef than anyone else on the planet. And he said he thought that would make a pretty cool introduction someday. And so here we are several years later, and I've got the opportunity. So ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the man who has seen more coral reef than anyone else on the face of the planet, Benjamin Neal. Ben, take it away. And thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you to everyone who is attending out there. I, of course, also can't see you, but I know you're out there, and I do know your area actually as well. My partner, my wife's father, had a house up by Coast Guard Beach, so just a little bit north of you. And my brother lived for years in Falmouth and worked down in Woods Hole. So it's a part of the world I know and really enjoy. So glad to be talking to you all down there. Well, let's get right on to the issue though of the evening, and I want to jump right into it and not mince words here. And the underlying point I want to make is that coral reefs are dying. They're dying as an ecosystem, and they're dying right now within our lifetimes. Coral reefs are so imperiled that, in fact, they're being considered for listing by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is what handles the red list of endangered species, as an ecosystem. So they are a highly endangered ecosystem that, in fact, is at risk of functionally disappearing from the surface of the planet, which is an alarming situation, and is larger than any other ecosystem in terms of the threats that it's facing. They're at risk from both local and global stressors. So globally, what I mean by this is things like increasing ocean acidity, which is happening all around the globe in the surface waters of the ocean from carbon dioxide emissions. And the sea surface temperature is also increasing. It's not as even across the surface of the globe. Some places are worse than others, but the surface ocean is slowly but steadily increasing in temperature. And this is affecting coral reefs more than nearly any other ecosystem, or the coral reefs as equally as the Arctic. They're the two most imperiled systems. And it's kind of, there are still people who think, this isn't really a thing, that we're not having an increase in ocean acidity, for example. But I can tell you that with handheld equipment, I can take a coffee cup size sample anywhere from a boat, and I can easily detect that change in pH. The pH change in the surface of the ocean is real, and it's happening across the entire surface of the ocean. Local threats are also significant. Things like declines in fish populations, eutrophication, destructive fishing, and I'll be touching on each of these points in the talk today. And one of the other ideas that I want to leave you with is not only that this is an imperiled threatened ecosystem, threatened with extinction, but that the speed of this change is moving faster than our ability to monitor these ecosystems. And as I hope you'll also see in today's talk, the ability that we have to monitor these ecosystems is quite astounding. There's remarkable technology being employed in coral reef science. And yet, there are places where coral reefs are disappearing that have never been measured by science. They've never been, there are species out there that have never been described that may disappear before we ever describe them scientifically. And this has led some coral reef observers, in particular, Dr. Charlie Veron, who is the author of Corals of the World. And that's an impressive book title. It's even a more impressive book. It weighs about 10 pounds, 3 volumes. And he's the author of it, and he's personally named about 1/3 of the species in it. And he suggests that we're heading for the 6th great mass extinction in the 4.5 billion year history of our planet. So these are not lightweight things, this idea that we may be headed for an extinction in coral reef systems. I do want to first, though, introduce myself. And thank you, Stephen, for that excellent introduction into what I do. And I've spent a good part of the last couple of years working out of Australia before I came home to Maine, operating this camera right here, which is part of the Catlin Seaview survey. And most of the images that you'll see in today's slideshow were taken by me or by the people I worked with using this camera system right here. And what this is it's akin to Google Street View underwater. And I think we've all become used to the idea that you can explore anywhere you want, in terms of the built landscape, or in some cases even the natural landscape terrestrially on Google Street View. It's again remarkable that you can visit places and walk down the streets of New Orleans or New York and see what it looks like. And the object of this study was to be able to do the same thing underwater. So we would go about 2 kilometers underwater with the camera that you see here, which is about 6.5 feet long and weighs about 135 pounds. And we would be recording an image every 3 seconds as we went along that's panoramic, the same way that you see the street view images when you're looking at them on your screen and walking down a city street. And this has been a pretty useful and remarkable public relations tool. So this is a picture of me operating in the Maldives in the central Indian Ocean across a really remarkable reef of corals right there. Here's another image of what it looks like. It's a great place to work. I love these dives. I feel like actually it's never enough time underwater. And this is one of the many times in my working life when I feel like I can actually almost audibly hear the call of the deep blue. And every time I have to leave, I sort of regret it, going back up to the surface. And here's a picture of me, I think from the Chagos archipelago, also in the Indian Ocean. And you can see here that remarkably clear water that coral reefs need to survive. This stunningly clear water where light penetrates right down. And one of the big ideas behind why coral reefs are in areas where there's such remarkable lighting is because they are this symbiosis of animal and plant. So these corals that you see down here are all animals, but living within them are tissues of microscopic plants that provide a lot of their synthate, or a lot of their food for survival. And this is just a little bit of a close-up of the same shot showing that instrument. We have 3 Canon 5D Mark II cameras up in the bow of that thing, firing every 3 seconds, taking these really large, high definition panoramic images as you go across the surface of the coral reef. These images have been put online by Google Earth as part of what's called Google Underwater Street View. And I encourage you, if you're interested, to go and have a look at this website. I do this regularly. I feel like I don't get enough diving, especially during the pandemic, and I'm often going actually to look at places and see what it looks like. So it can be pretty enjoyable in the depth of a New England winter to take a little dive down to the bottom of the coral reef. And supposedly these images have now exceeded 1.4 billion individual views. I wonder sometimes if that's true, if we've really reached, 1/6 or 1/7 of the world's population. But even if we haven't, it's still pretty remarkable that a billion times these images have been accessed, and that's really the goal, is to get the entire world underwater and to appreciate what these ecosystems look like and how vibrant they are, for the world's population that doesn't dive or won't dive, and or can't dive, and so to be able to appreciate what's going on down there. And the real reason for that is that coral reefs do a lot for our planet. So globally, it's estimated that coral reefs provide about 375 billion in ecosystem services annually. Um, and I guess I would like to start. I have a little list of these physical services and biological services that are provided. But I would also say that when I look at images like this, I also think of the moral services, and in fact perhaps even verging on sort of the religious services, thinking, these are amazing places, and I never get tired of just looking out over a coral reef landscape. This particular one is from the Great Barrier Reef, which has lost about 50% of its area in the last 25 years or so because of anthropogenic or man-caused ecological damage. And I look at them and I think of the time it's taken to evolve these remarkable ecosystems, and I wonder if, do we not have a responsibility to take care of these on our watch? But to look at this a little bit more practically, a good part of that 375 billion is in direct services, one of the biggest of which is fisheries. And the fisheries protein that's provided by coral reefs is provided disproportionately in the developing portions of the world. So Indonesia, the Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and a lot of these places, the coral reefs are real workhorses in terms of providing a constant supply of fish and marine products for both export for money as well as for direct protein consumption by the populations in these places. Another really important service is recreational and diving. Across the Caribbean, this is a significant portion of the entire the economy of those countries. So across the world, ecotourism and particularly diving are a growing trade, and it's a lucrative trade, and it's a lucrative trade for places that don't necessarily have other economic industries to turn to. Another service that's still provided is that of the physical reef itself. Here is a shot of a woman harvesting bits of the calcium carbonate substrate. And coral reefs are made of the same stuff as clams and oysters. It's calcium carbonate, and they they fix this calcium carbonate in much the same way. And so this woman is harvesting dead coral reef, or the pavement that we often call it, and this will go directly into service as a building product. So coral reefs are really the first the inventors of concrete. It's the same stuff as concrete that's going on here. And they were harvested at one point for being ground down and going into the concrete trade, in fact. But even when they're not used for human habitation, they're still providing an architectural service in the form of being a break out in front of these tropical islands. So here's another estimation of the economic value of just under $1 billion worth of coastal flood protection. So you can see right here that these large waves are coming in from the ocean, and they're breaking along the edge of the reef, creating the lagoon that you see, if you can see my cursor, coming in just a little bit closer here, just over where the settled shoreline begins. And again, this is just a remarkable service. How nice is that a natural system is creating a fence some distance out to take the brunt out of the waves. Something upwards of 90% of the wave energy is dissipated when it hits a healthy coral reef. And a recent paper just came out which I thought was really clever, in collaboration with an engineering firm that, sorry about this, my slides are advancing automatically. I'll continue to put them back. I'm not sure why they're doing that. But there was a paper that came out in conjunction with an engineering firm that showed that if you reduce the surface height of the coral reef only about 50 centimeters, or about 1.5 or 2 feet, that you're nearly completely eliminating this this reduction in wave energy. So what we need is, we don't need the coral reef to be dead. We need that coral reef to be alive, and to be alive nearly up to the level of the up to sea level. So given all of these services, I think it's also appropriate and necessary to go over the threats that exist to coral reefs, the acute threats that are happening right now. Globally, about roughly 1/3, you could say, of coral reefs are gone, totally eliminated as a live functional system. And about a further 1/3 are under dire threat. So 2/3 of coral reefs could not exist within about 15 or 20 years, according to some predictions. And the level of threat of coral reefs cannot be overstated. These threats are also rapidly evolving worldwide. There are new conditions that are coming out. I'll talk about one right at the end of this slideshow. But there are new diseases and new conditions that we as scientists are working on, that are evolving and just coming to our knowledge. Ironically, the greatest threats are right in the area called the Coral Triangle. And the Coral Triangle is formed by the Philippines and Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. And it's a triangle that encompasses the widest biodiversity of coral reefs and the most extensive coverage of coral reefs. Roughly 50% of all the coral reefs in the world fall into this relatively small space, the Coral Triangle. And both of those, or I should say, really all three of those governments that we're talking about, or perhaps four, counting East Timor, but the Philippines, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, all of the governments in that area are hard pressed, and they're extremely hard pressed for investing anything in ecological protection. And unfortunately, the state of coral reefs in this developing region mirrors that lack of investment, and it's the spot where basically the most harm is taking place. We can see up in the upper picture here what a vibrant coral reef should look like. You can see all of the colors that you see from the pigments that are contained in the corals. You can see the diversity of shapes, which represents a diversity of species in that area. And you can see the clouds of large and small fish that are using this area as habitat. Coral reefs, like a forest, are structure creating ecosystems. And if you take out that really keystone species, the coral reefs themselves, you lose that structure that so many of the other organisms depend on. So if you take out the corals themselves, you really end up with a system that's very depauperate in terms of its ability to provide for the food chain services for turtles, for marine mammals, for the fish populations that live in that area. And on the bottom, we have a typical scene that I've seen an awful lot of down here, a typical scene of a ruined coral reef. And I think it's particularly poignant to look at this and realize that the coral architecture is still visible. This has just happened. It's not that long ago that this bottom picture looked like the top picture. And it's not that long in the future where the bottom picture is just going to look smooth like pavement, where algae will overgrow all of that, and you won't even be able to see the remnant shapes of what was once there. And what I fear for that is that we lose that understanding of where those reefs even existed, and that we continue on without knowing how vibrant and how extensive these systems could have been. And the place that's really having this happen is the Caribbean. So there's two main types of threats that I want to go over: global threats and local threats. And the biggest of the global threats is manifesting worldwide in a phenomenon called coral bleaching. And I have an image of that right here showing a coral of the same species in a healthy state on the left and a coral in its bleached state on the right. The coral on the left has all of the photosynthetic pigments within it that make it a healthy coral animal. And those photosynthetic pigments are really just like the same ones that are found in the leaves of trees. So of course, everyone here in New England knows how remarkable the shift is from the green of summer to the browns and yellows and reds of autumn. And those are the same color hues. Again, I apologize for this automatic advancing. I'm not sure why that's happening. Those are the same color hues that you see in coral reefs. So these are colors that we're used to. And the picture on the right is from when those pigments are gone, when the symbiotic algae that live inside corals have gone out of the tissue of the corals. And the really poignant part of the picture on the right is that that coral is not dead. And it's really important to understand that the coral animal, the tissue of the coral animal is still there. It's still filter feeding, which is another function that it can do. And it's still capable of repopulating with those pigments and turning that healthy color again and being a living coral. But it's an incredibly stressful event. And it's associated with widespread coral mortality. And I read a figure once that stated that the mortality post-bleaching is between 1 and 100%. A typical scientific kind of statement that's really kind of meaningless. The way I like to think of it is it's usually around 50% roughly for all coral species. For branching species like this, it's roughly 75%. And for the massive or mounding species, it's more like 25 to 40%. But these branching species are disproportionately important in terms of creating habitat. And they're also disproportionately susceptible to bleaching and death. And here's the process that's happening right here. In the upper left, we see a cross section of one of those branching corals showing the thin layer of live coral tissue that surrounds the skeleton that you look at around here. In this way, it's a little bit like us. We are a thin layer, a somewhat thin layer of tissue that surrounds a skeleton. Corals do not have muscles in the same way that we do, or a vascular system, or lots of other features. But there is, in the center of that, this stiff calcium carbonate skeleton. And on the outer part of that is the living tissue. The difference is, within that living tissue are dinoflagellates, which are a type of phytoplankton. And these phytoplankton, over millions of years, have developed what's called an obligate symbiosis, or they've developed a lifestyle that requires them to live inside of the corals. And the corals dispose of their waste products the same way that we do, but they don't excrete their waste products. They dispose of their waste products within the tissue, and those waste products are then utilized by the photosynthetic algae that are in there. So they're getting protection, they're getting a good place to live, and they're getting a constant supply of nutrients. And in return, they leach out their synthate, which are essentially sugars. Like any plant, they're creating sugars, and they're leaching that inside the tissues. There's no equivalent of this symbiosis really sort of anywhere else in the animal kingdom. It's as if we were able to grow algae in our hair, or our hair could grow leaves, and then those leaves were directly injecting, that food substance into our bloodstream, into our head. That would be quite amazing. You just walk around in the sun and you'd feel full. Well, that's what corals are doing. It's when that system is disrupted, again, they don't die right away, but it's an extremely big disruption to their energy flow. And it really means they're not able to continue growing and developing these large structures that we think of as coral reefs. Another thing that happens is when they die like that, they're covered really quickly in filamentous algae. Anyone who has a boat knows that, whatever you put in the water is going to get a scum growing on it right away. And that scum is very quickly going to turn into a beard of algae, surrounding your boat. The same thing happens when coral reefs bleach and die. They get covered in this filamentous algae. And we think that this could be essentially a one-way street to a different ecosystem. There's a phase shift that happens where the baby corals are not able to reestablish in this algae-dominated world, and we're switching over to a system where recovery very well could not take place. And this is what it looks like when you swim over one of those bleached places. This is an acroporid coral, a finely branched acroporid coral, and it's bleached out all along there. This is out off the Great Barrier Reef, and this area had upwards of 50% mortality of the corals that you're looking at right there. And they become algae covered and they fall in. In this case, along the Great Barrier Reef, there was enough of an influx of baby corals coming in for this to recover. But again, we may be reaching this tipping point where recovery from these kind of stress events is not possible. And that process that I'm talking about is called algal overgrowth. And it's also enhanced by nutrient pollution. So what I'm getting at here is that there's a synergy or a perfect storm of a lot of this stuff happening, where we have both terrestrial and man-made nutrient pollution in a lot of these coral areas, meaning that there's sewage outfalls, there's runoff from development in places like Maui from green lawns that's introducing a large amount of nutrients into the water, and this finally changes the balance in favor of the algae that are there, and they can permanently take over. And this is what it looks like. So just quickly to have a look, you can go from this kind of system, which represents a hard, permanent habitat creating system, to this type of flatter, fleshy, algae dominated system that does not provide the kind of ecosystem services in terms of fish production that we're used to coming from a coral reef. Another problem is overfishing, and not just overfishing, but in fact damage from the gear as well. And I think that everybody here in New England knows this story. We are living in the aftermath of one of the sort of biggest overfishing episodes ever on one of the greatest fisheries that mankind has ever fished on, which is the codfish fishery. And we're also experiencing habitat change through the action of bottom drags in certain places. And so worldwide, we're still in a situation where we're basically taking out 2 to 3 times as many fish as can be replaced. And this is particularly acute in tropical reef ecosystems because they're not that productive actually they're not as productive in terms of producing the overall biomass as a lot of the systems that we're used to, like off Cape Cod. But tropical reef systems still provide, as I said in my introduction, food for about 500 million people worldwide. And again, disproportionately in the Coral Triangle, or that area around Indonesia and the Philippines. And so overfishing changes this community structure, and it removes disproportionately the largest fishes. These images here are from a paper by my spouse, Lauren McClanahan, where she's showing the decline in large fish catch at the same area using the same gear across about 70 years. This is a picture from the 1950s showing large sharks, and then moving on into the 1980s where they're still catching grouper, but the sizes are changing, to a picture that we took in the early 2000s with one small shark and a few scattered snapper and grouper. And this kind of change is happening in a lot of coral reef systems. And one of the reasons why this is important is because those functional groups matter. Taking out the herbivores off of coral reefs matters because of the algae overgrowth that I was showing a second ago. These herbivores are essentially the cleaners on the reef. And by removing them, you're removing that cleaning function that takes place. Furthermore, the overfishing tends to disproportionately target large predators. and large predators should have a much higher biomass, a much larger level of predatory fish biomass. In a healthy reef, essentially the biomass of fish is stored in the bodies of these large predators, and the smaller fish are turning over a lot faster. And this has been just removed. Over 90% of that biomass has been removed, largely because of the shark fin fishery in tropical systems. So boats will go out and they'll catch sharks, they'll cut the fins off and let the bodies go. They're not even worth landing the bodies. And they'll dry those fins for shark fin soup in Southeast Asia. And that shark fin soup is basically a luxury food product, and that luxury food product is having this impact of changing the way that these trophic chains work in the coral reefs. We can see that right here. This is a picture of these colorful fish are parrotfish, and these parrotfish are slower moving. They're highly visible. They're also extremely tasty, and they're highly targeted by both hook and line and spearfishing techniques. And we can see this in a lot of tropical fish markets. So this, again, taking out these parrotfish, these are herbivores or the cleaners of the reef. And so it has this impact of enhancing the algal overgrowth that I've talked about before. We can see this overfishing a lot of times when we're down on the bottom. You have to sort of get your eye used to it. But in this case, this is an example from the conch fishery. This is a conch right here, a picture that I took down in Belize on a coral reef. And when the conch have been harvested, they have this distinctive notch that's cut right here by humans to sever the muscle and pull out the muscle that's so valuable for conch fritters and for export, actually. And you can also see piles as you're going along diving, piles of dead conch shells, which is a surefire indication of again human harvest and of this over harvest of these species in this area. Another thing is that you really only see small size sharks and small size groupers. This is another picture that I took from Belize, but this is maybe a 2-foot long grouper, which makes a very tasty sandwich. However, even a 2-foot long grouper like this could easily show up in the market, but this grouper has not yet reached sexual maturity. We have to be smarter about how we understand the reproduction and how we understand the ontological or developmental cycles of these fish to realize that we shouldn't be out there killing these babies, even if they're big enough to send to market. And again, a lot less sharks. And this is a picture I took in the world's largest marine protected area, which is the Chagos Archipelago, or we all know it better as Diego Garcia Air Base. This is an air base located just south of India that's extremely hard to get into. And it's arguably one of the world's only effective marine protected areas because it's patrolled by the US Air Force, because the Diego Garcia Air Base is where we house our nuclear weapons, and not to mention all the rest of our supplies for our various missions that are taking place in the Middle East. And so it's an extremely well patrolled area in terms of any incursions by boat. And I was lucky enough to do a couple of trips there as an invited scientist. And it's just so notable how many more sharks there are. I had a funny thing happen there once where we did this 2-kilometer long transect using the camera that I showed you earlier. And we go down below, and we have a buoy that we tow on the surface with a flag on it. We can't see the boat that's following us. And we go along and we do our imaging, and you're very focused on operating the camera and the computers. And we finished our dive as normal, and we did our safety stop all according to time. But then when we came up, a big squall had come through and the boat lost contact with us. And we rapidly blew south off the reef, and we were out in very deep water. So as we blew off the reef, though, we picked up a cloud of about 30 sharks below us that just circled, waiting for something. And I wasn't too worried about them coming in for a nip, but it was a little bit disconcerting. There we were, darkness was falling, we were drifting south towards Antarctica, and all of our underwater radios failed in terms of calling the chase boat. Luckily, the captain on our ship regarded this as a serious situation and sent everyone out. And we were able to flag them down after about an hour and a half or so, just as the sunset was ending. So we didn't have to spend a night out there. But it was an interesting example of how dense the sharks are. I think I did 7 weeks on one trip in Indonesia without seeing a single shark by comparison. And those should not be different systems. Another thing that's threatening coral reefs is the way that people are fishing them. So destructive fishing takes place in a lot of these ecosystems. And there's 3 kinds that I'm going to talk about today: dynamite fishing, bleach fishing, and a thing called muroami fishing. And dynamite fishing is just what it sounds like. I'll return to that previous picture. Dynamite fishing is just what it sounds like. You go out in a small boat, you take sticks of dynamite, set them off, throw them as far as you can by hand. They blast down in the water. The fish are all affected by barotrauma, which is the shock wave of the explosive, and they float to the surface, either dead or badly stunned. The recovery rate for this is somewhere around 15 to 30% at best. Sometimes they send divers down to collect the fish off the bottom, but most of it is just fish that float to the surface, and they pick up what fish they can, and they move on. Not only are they killing all sizes of fish when they do this, but they're injuring presumably a much larger percentage of fish as well. Plus, they're destroying the ecosystem. And I've heard this. I've been fishing out in North Sulawesi in Indonesia, in an area where this takes place. Ironically, in a national park, they call it. And I could hear the blasts going off in the distance. It's really difficult to approach these people because they then they just leave that area. But I've heard it underwater, which is worrying, going on, and I've seen it, and it looks just like you'd expect. There are just these dead craters on the bottom, just as if bombs had gone off, which of course is exactly what has happened. And it's destructive for the people too, and the social systems that rely on this. This man right here in the Philippines lost his hand to an explosive. He still looks cheerful. They're wonderful, cheerful people, I have to say. Great fishermen in the Philippines. So, bless him for being so cheerful. But this clearly is not the best thing for the ecosystem, or for the longevity of the fishery, or for the market, or for the people that are involved. And bleach fishing is another thing that goes on. Here's a fisherman bleach fishing right here. He has a bleach bottle full of either bleach or cyanide diluted, and he's squirting it into the spaces because that's where all the fish are hiding in these systems. They see the divers coming, and they go down into their interstitial spaces, just as many of these species do at night, and they wait it out. And then he goes along, spots them, and squirts the bleach directly in. The fish are stunned, and you're able to reach in and pull them out, or they come out. They just float out of these hiding spots. Ironically, a lot of these fish enter the live food fish trade. So these are really valuable groupers and snappers, and they're badly toxified, but they're not necessarily dead. And they'll recover and be put into the live food fish trade, which is to say the restaurants that you can go to where there's a simulated coral reef tank, and you can say, I would like that fish right there. And they take it out, they kill it on the spot, and they serve it in a number of different ways, including the liver, where these toxins can build up. So destructive fishing, again, in many ways. And it's also toxic to the corals. And we've seen a lot of these white patches where you can tell that bleach fishing has gone on, where the coral in that area has been killed by the toxin that they're injecting. But take a look at this diver more closely. So this diver has plywood paddles down here, and this is inner tube rubber that's been stapled on as his flippers. These are people who don't have a lot of resources, and they have no other choice. And as Stephen, I think, hinted at, my entry into marine science came from commercial fishing. I was a commercial fisherman in Alaska and on Cape Cod, actually, and southern Maine, and down in the Chesapeake and in California before I went into marine science. And I know what it feels like to be fishing for a paycheck. And so I have sympathy and empathy for these folks, but I also have criticism for the way that they're carrying out their fishing. And this guy right here is fishing with no instruments, I notice, on his hands. And also this airline, you'll notice no tanks. He's fishing off of a surface compressor through this surface line that comes down here and is clipped on with nothing more than a clip for hanging your laundry that you see right here. So he's clipping this into his mask, through he drills a small hole, and he's basically just clipping that on so he doesn't lose his air hose. And these guys fish down to like 80, 100 feet using this, remarkably not safety conscious type of dive gear right here. And this is what you end up with. You end up with, again, an area where the live coral is dead and it's just dropped off like this. And again, this is an area that's on the evolutionary pathway to being just pavement. It's a recently dead, within 5 years or so, a recently killed ecosystem that you're looking at right there. There's another type of fishing that goes on in coral reefs called muroami fishing, where you take a net and you pound the net along the reef to collect up all of the fish, and you need a lot of people to do this. They dive down and pound it right along the way that they go. They have rocks on strings actually that they pick up and drop, and that collects all the fish into the net. And disproportionately, this type of fishing is practiced by crews of young boys. So this is essentially slavery going on. And this has been made into a movie, in fact, an award-winning movie by Cesar Montano, called Muroami, or Reef Hunters, which is a really touching and tragic movie to watch if you ever get a copy of it. They're hard to come across. But these boats look like this. They're ex-ferries that are carrying 200, a crew of 200 boys or so, and they go out on the reef and they send them out to dive multiple times a day to collect up this fish. Again, oftentimes for the export market. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm pointing the finger too hard at other countries here. I've been to all of these countries and I love the people. I love the food. I recognize that they're wonderful cultures. And so I just want to say that this kind of fishing also happens here in the US. Here's a picture from Maui within the last couple of years showing illegal drift gill nets from the reef. This type of fishing is completely banned in Hawaii, and yet you can see it's still happening. And they're catching sharks. Here's the tail of another shark right here. And wrapped up on the back of this lifeguard sled right there are 3 loggerhead turtles that you see right up in there. So, this stuff happens as well in developed countries. And another threat that's happening on coral reefs is wastewater. This is an image of a wastewater pipe, and this is just a direct, pure, untreated sewage pipe coming out from a town. I did a long trip in East Timor, which is the world's second newest country after a bloody revolution to split off from Indonesia. Wonderful country, terrific fabrics, textiles, another one of my interests. Really wonderful people, wonderful art. There is not a single secondary sewage treatment system in the entire country. All of the sewage is pumped straight out on the reef, and their entire coastline, north and south of this country, is coral reefs. And I kind of, scientifically, I kind of like this stuff. My wife calls it poo diving, and I have an affinity for it. It's true. This is where the action is. There's diseases happening there. There's coral reef damage going on there, and I didn't really care too much about it actually until the last few years. I guess I'm getting a little older, but I caught 2 things. I caught flesh-eating bacteria on one trip, which started eating into the bones of my feet. That was an issue that I had to get treated in Australia. And then I also caught some kind of rare bacteria that ate the corneas off of my eyes, leading to the most painful thing I've ever experienced, and temporary blindness, which was not tremendous either. But they do regenerate. It's the most quickly regenerating tissue in the human body. So luckily that turned out. But I now consider a little more closely the viral and bacterial loads when I go poo diving. Another issue is plastics in the water. This is an image I shot in, I think again in Sulawesi in Indonesia, and this was off a really nice looking little village, and we got dropped off there. My partner, who's in the background right here, and I got dropped off, and that camera that I showed you earlier takes only circular images, and then we correct them to make the panoramic images that I talked about being put onto Google Google underwater street view. And in this case, this is what one of the raw images looks like. And this is a beautiful reef right off of this village. And there was something floating in front of me that you see right here that I'm indicating with my cursor. And my partner said, "Hey, look at that. What is that thing floating over to you? Is that a coconut or something?" And I said, "I think it is. I think it's a rotten coconut." And I reached out and gave it a big squeeze, and I should have recognized it because I already had children. It's just a degraded, wrapped up diaper. And just what you think of came squirting out of it right there on the spot. So I turned on the camera and shot these images of all of this plastic trash and of this diaper there. And I would have never believed that we could produce as much trash in the ocean as I saw. And I've seen it, and it's a problem. Like, plastic trash is built up to the point where I've done whole dives where I've never been outside of the site of it, going by like driving through a New England snowstorm, literally, like, plastic trash just going by as I'm moving this camera through the water. So even something as simple as managing our solid waste is a serious threat to the nearshore environment of coral reefs. So again, I was just talking about the two main types of threats, global and local, and I touched on some of them right here. But I don't want this to be all doom and gloom, and I want to say the two main types of recovery that we're seeing are also global and also local in scope. And again, this is what a coral reef should look like here, and this is the kind of system that we're all working to try to rebuild. And then I have a deep faith that we can rebuild. And so coral reef science is also happening from molecular scales, things like diseases, out to people addressing the global scope, which largely has to do with global warming, carbon emissions, nitrogen emissions, and things like that. And it's integrating a lot of new technologies like machine learning, genetic sequencing, remote sensing from satellites. So there's a huge array of science that's going on to address these issues. And I feel like I've been lucky enough to participate in a number of those different types. And it's an extremely active field worldwide, especially in Australia and in Europe. And now I feel grateful to say that it's also developing in developing nations. A big part of the work that I do is to include researchers from developing nations on all of my expeditions and essentially do that technology transfer. This has been really accelerated in a positive way by the global pandemic, which is pretty interesting. I think that we've had to move towards local empowerment, and I think it's a wonderful byproduct that's come out of this. So here's an example of what some of that looks like. This is sort of classical old school reef science over here on the left. This guy's putting out a transect to count what's going on here. I can tell from the species that this image is from the Caribbean. This is a rare example of elkhorn coral here, or Acropora palmata, which is 99.8% reduced in its extent throughout the Caribbean. And over here, we have an image of a local researcher working on growing fragments. You can fragment these corals and grow them out and go to the bottom and cement them down. And remarkably, you can begin one seed at a time to rebuild these coral reef systems. It seems almost, sort of futile given the scale of loss, but it's taking up worldwide now, and reefs are now being rebuilt in this fashion. The first recorded case of natural sexual reproduction from an outplanted fragmented coral has taken place and has been documented. And I think that's a real milestone to say this can happen. This is where we're going, and this can happen. My personal contribution is a little bit more in the realm of using artificial intelligence, or AI. I was part of a program that developed an AI-enabled interface to process all of the images that I was taking myself. So these underwater images get entered into this system online, and they get processed, and the system gradually learns what each of the corals is, and then is able to start making those identifications itself. And the eventual idea here is that we're going to have a system, perhaps ideally, where I would just walk down to the edge of the reef and throw in a sensor, and it would drive itself along a pre-programmed track. I would go back and have a drink somewhere, And then that evening it would come back in, and over dinner I would discuss what it has to tell me. That's, I guess, where we're moving, where maybe we don't need divers at all, but we're far, far from that. And so there's a lot of development that needs to take place from between here and there. And I also am working on investigating a newly discovered temperature sensitive disease that's taking place based on fungus. So this is a really interesting field where this fungus is taking over the bottom of the coral reefs, especially when they get hotter, which of course is happening, worldwide. But the second thing we discovered, which is really just fabulous stuff, is that fish love this fungus. So there's already a natural control mechanism in place if we just wouldn't kill all the herbivorous fish. This is an example of a surgeon fish up here on the right, and a parrotfish here on the left. And both of these fish go for this fungus in a disproportionate fashion. In other words, they like it. They seek it out when it's out there. And that's what this recent paper is about right here, is that this might represent a natural control mechanism and another reason why we should work towards maintaining these healthy herbivorous fish populations. There is one part of this chain right here that we have no idea about, which is, why do fish do this? And the sort of ostensible answer is they might be going after it just because these fungi, which are basically mushrooms, are saprophytic, meaning that they break down the tissue and make it softer, which is the same thing that fungi do when you see a birch log. They're penetrating into the birch log, and they're breaking down all that stuff inside, leaving that roll of birch bark on the outside. So that's one reason. But the second reason, which is really intriguing, is that, of course, fungi produce all kinds of really astounding secondary metabolites, which is why some people take psychedelic mushrooms. And I just wonder, as I watch these fish, I think, like, are they doing that? What are they after in there? So I think it's an illustration of how, when you discover one thing in science, you're just opening another door, or actually you're opening like 8 other doors to possibly walk down, and there's no end to the wonder of that. The question I have, though, to end with is the scale of this science, which is wonderful stuff involving computers and satellites and high-tech cameras, is this enough? Are we actually addressing the threat that we see out there? And my answer so far has been no. I've seen a lot more destruction than I've seen rebuilding in the 20 some years I've been looking at coral reefs. I hope within my lifetime that trajectory turns around. But I think it's an alarming question to ask, is, even with all of this effort, is it enough? Are we putting enough effort in to work towards conservation and protection of these coral reef ecosystems? And I'm going to end on the optimistic idea that we are, that in fact, this is what coral reef, this is what coral reefs should look like. And this is a picture that was only taken a couple of years ago. They're still out there. These systems are still out there. They're still wonderful. They're still magic. And the time is still there to conserve them. But that time is now. And the time to take that action, and the time to get on this and really apply what we know scientifically and in terms of conservation is right now. And I'll end right there, Stephen, and turn it back over to you for any questions that anyone has in the audience.
Yeah, that was terrific, Ben. Thanks so much. So folks, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. Just type them in down there at the bottom of the screen. And Ben, I'll start you off on a good one, which is how much of the damage that you're observing and others are observing is from ocean acidification and kind of this thermal stress versus some of the shorter term factors like pollution and overfishing that might be able to be addressed more quickly.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's keeping in that schema of local versus global. And on the dark side, that brings up the question of, are you doing any good with your local actions anyway? Because if the effects of sea surface SST, sea surface temperature rise, and ocean acidification are going to happen anyway, then things like MPAs, which are marine protected areas, or planting out fragments, which I mentioned in the course of this talk, or other standard conservation measures, they're not going to make a difference if we're looking at this global juggernaut of OA, ocean acidification, and temperature change. Of those two, I think sea surface temperature change represents by far the largest risk. So we can chart how we are going over the temperature threshold now in most coral reef ecosystems about 3 years out of 10. And that number has gone up, we believe, from roughly 1 year in 25. So coral bleaching is normal, and corals do live close to this edge of like, they want to be on the hot edge because that's the system that they occupy because they want the sunlight. But in doing so, they're living on that hot edge, and that hot edge has gone over the limit a lot more often now. And it's projected in some studies to be going over the limit where it's happening every year as soon as 2030. I don't think we're quite there yet. The atmosphere does have amelioration and cooling mechanisms as well, but we're close. And I guess it's the same message. We need to take action on that, on carbon emissions, right now to be able to slow that down. Ocean acidification represents a different threat. And this is a point I make in my classes a lot. I think people feel like ocean acidification is put out there in the press as like it's all turning to vinegar in the upper 50 meters of the water column, and it's not. Lobsters are not going to dissolve, in the next 25 years. But the insidious part of it is that the energetics behind it are much worse. And so what's really happening with the change in ocean acidification is not that corals are dissolving, but it's that it's becoming energetically a lot harder for them to make calcium carbonate. And we can measure this very subtly in the two different forms of calcium carbonate that are made. And so the percentage of what's called aragonite is changing. So we can already see that the corals are adapting, or not adapting, they're responding, to this, and it's already present as a threat. Interestingly, in evolutionary terms, this has happened before, and corals actually lost and regained the ability to calcify. I take pretty small comfort from that, to tell you the truth, because those are natural processes going over millions of years and through great mass extinctions. That's not the system we want as humans. So the answer to both of these things is less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Both global warming through greenhouse gases, which is physically a very different process from ocean acidification, they're coming from carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is absorbed into the water and turns into carbonic acid, which is what's causing the pH to drop. And so far, the pH has dropped roughly 0.1 points, but it's on the way to 0.2 or 0.3. And 0.3 points represents roughly 150% increase in acidity. It's a complicated log scale, so it doesn't take very much on that scale of pH to make a big change. I guess I would call, if you had something that you had to deal with like right now, this year, I would think deal with local threats. If you have something that you need to deal with on a decadal scale, it's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if you look at something that we all need to deal with on a 1,000-year scale or 100-year or century scale, it's ocean acidification.
Very thoughtful answer. Thank you. Let's see, here's a more specific one. How is the St. Vincent volcano eruption affecting coral reefs at Tobago Keys? I don't know if that's a specific one. I don't know if you know anything about what's going on. But.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I follow that just out of interest. And of course, that the latest eruption, it has happened before. It's built up into a real eruption now, but I would call that a very localized occurrence. And the interesting thing about localized occurrences, particularly in the Caribbean, it's maybe I'm just saying that because I'm a little more familiar with it, but I think it is actually a much higher energy system in terms of disruption by hurricanes. And the ability for Caribbean coral reefs to respond when you have a healthy coral reef is astounding. You can level a coral reef if it's made up of acroporids, of those branching corals that I showed, and within 8 years, it'll be back to nearly the same functional level. If you're dealing with a healthy population of acroporids. So I would consider things like lava eruptions, in Hawaii, and the volcano that's happening right now that you've mentioned, to be super localized, normal ecological events, from which, normal disturbance events, from which you'll have, if it's all correct, you'll have really rapid and normal recovery. And I would encourage everybody out there to watch a movie called Chasing Coral. Chasing coral is largely actually about the same kind of destruction that I'm talking about right here, and they show a heartrending series of what happens to a coral reef after it bleaches on a matter of months. So only I think it's like 3 or 4 months of shots that they have, and you can see the structure already beginning to break down. And I was involved in slightly in the making of this movie. But then years later, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great to make a movie that shows the opposite, that shows actual natural regeneration of a coral reef using time-lapse photography? Because it's only about it happens on less than a decadal level if the reef is healthy. And I know that because I've been to places and seen it recover, but I've never seen a time-lapse, series of this recovery happening. But I take a lot of optimism from this idea that if you give it a decade or less, it'll come back, in terms of being a reef. But again, that's only if you have the population of source corals to repopulate that. And it's only if you don't have localized issues like sewage runoff, or sedimentation, which is a big one, which clouds the water column, or again, overfishing. If you've removed all the herbivores, these natural processes can't take place. So for that one case example that you bring up, I wouldn't worry too much about it, but I'd love to go there. I mean, I'd love to go there and take some images, because it's a really interesting case of what I would legitimately call natural disturbance.
Great. As these issues have become more pronounced, have you seen an increase in the funding for the type of work you and others are doing in research, protection, and conservation?
No, nope. Maybe nationally. I mean, maybe internationally, but not nationally. And without like naming names here, the last 4 years were terrible for people in natural resources and in sciences. I feel lucky to have been working at the place I work at, Colby College. Our job was fine, but I have plenty of friends who work at NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, or the EPA, which was heavily involved in all ecosystem science, who their jobs were eliminated, departments were eliminated. So no, I don't have anything that good to say about funding and how it's coming. And you might have noticed on the side of that camera, that I was driving in the first few images, it says the Catlin Insurance Company. That's a Bermuda-based reinsurance company, and they sponsored that whole project, to the tune of, I think it was somewhere like 12 to 15 million. It was a significant amount of money that represented something like 75% of their advertising budget for the period when they did it, and that's remarkable that they made that corporate money made that effort to think that their advertising would be best spent, supporting science. So we actually were all, it was like being part of a NASCAR team. It was kind of bizarre. We had, shirts, and we had stickers, and we changed the stickers to match the logo that they would send us. And we had a whole promotional team behind us for images and things like that. And I kind of enjoyed it. I kind of enjoyed being part of that project, but I did wonder, like, is this the new mode of funding science? I don't think it can be, but there's a ship out there, that's sponsored by the Schmidt Foundation, and they have actually 3 ships, one giant one, a full-on Woods Hole size oceanographic research vessel that's supported by a private nonprofit that's based on tech money, and that's amazing. And I did a trip like that too, actually, on a vessel called the Golden Shadow, and it was this giant private yacht, like 210 feet, where they would lift our research boats on deck every night using a big crane. And we had all the food was taken care of, and we slept in these wonderful staterooms, and they were supporting a round the world coral reef expedition. And that's now finished. But this vessel, the Golden Shadow, was the yacht of the sponsoring Khan, whose name I won't get right, so I won't say it. I would have to look it up. But it was Middle Eastern oil funded, royalty money sponsoring this excellent round the world ecological expedition because of the interests of the emir himself, which is wonderful. Like I thought it was an excellent trip. Interestingly, the Golden Shadow, though, was named the Golden Shadow because it was actually not his yacht. I found out when we were on board. It was the shadow vessel that supported his yacht that he had donated to support this trip, that would carry the helicopters and things like that. So that kind of funding is increasing, and I did participate in projects that are getting this level of private, funding. But I can't imagine that that's going to be the way that our international ecological conservation movement should go. And I believe that we need to move up in structure and begin to coordinate internationally and have a larger ecological presence. And certainly the UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, does something, but they don't do enough. The majority of the work that goes on around the world is sponsored by national agencies. In our case, the National Science Foundation. The fungal work that I showed you was National Science Foundation money. And that's where the bulk of that money comes from.
Interesting. Okay. My optimistic hope is that COVID will have driven up appreciation for nature and all things nature in the general public. I think in talking with my land trust colleagues, we've seen a lot of new members and people who have been out enjoying our trails. So hopefully some of that will overflow for years and decades to come. But
it is an interesting example, I think, of people around the world, thinking what really means a lot to us, and what do we want to conserve, and what kind of society and what kind of world do we really want.
Right.
So I do take optimism from that as well, Stephen. That's an interesting point.
This is a fun one. What is your favorite area of the world to dive in? Also, is there a U.S. organization, you kind of touched on this, but is there a U.S. organization that is leading the way in coral reef advocacy specifically, so not funding? Is it universities, researchers? And this person says, thank you for all your important work.
The second question was, is there a group that's leading the advocacy for coral reefs?
Yeah, in the U.S., is there a group that's really working on coral reef advocacy?
Yeah, well, I'll take those one at a time. I don't know. Favorite place to dive would be anywhere, like wherever I am. I once carried my mask. I often carry my mask and fins with me in my carry-on. I carry a spare pair because what if I lose them? So I do carry a mask, and I did once dive in a ditch outside outside of the Salt Lake City airport. I had a long layover, and I went for a walk, and then I was like, what is going on in there? And I stripped down to my shorts and put on my mask and went for a swim in some salty brine pool of runoff, next to the runway at the Salt Lake City airport. I would dive anywhere. Like, I love diving in Maine, and that would surprise you, I think, a little bit, which is that the diving off of New England in the winter is fabulous. I used to be a commercial diver. Briefly, I was a commercial scallop diver, and I did some mooring work and stuff before I went into science. And it's beautiful in the winter. Like, it's just stunning diving in Maine in the winter. In the summer, it's too thick. It's not great visibility. But I would say wherever I can get to. I mean, I will go snorkeling in fresh water just to look at bass and perch. Like, I'll definitely get in the water no matter where it is. I do love Hawaii, I have to say. And Hawaii is a heavily populated place and has lots of critical things about it. But one of the things I love about Hawaii is you can go right from the shore there, and you're in you can be in marvelous places really, really easily. So I would dive anywhere. I think I've always been like that. Like, I remember hiking, like, as a youth in the Bahamas, coming in from a trip at sea where we delivered a boat down when I used to sail more from New England. We delivered a boat down, and then I walked maybe like 6 miles to find a decent place to go snorkeling the morning after we pulled in. So I don't know. I guess I would go anywhere. Although the Chagos Archipelago was the most remarkable place I've ever been diving. And it was remarkable, dive after dive after dive. And there are some great images on that Google Earth underwater. There's 3 dives that have been put together by Google that are all based on images that either I shot or someone on my trip shot. There's Ile de Vache, which I think is called Isle of the Cow. And then there's a couple others on there as well. And they're you'll get a really good sense for what it looks like there by clicking through these Google Street View underwater images, and you just need to type in Google Street View underwater, and I think you'll get it right away.
I posted that link in the chat for anyone who does
Oh,
want
great. Yeah.
and then there was a question about an advocacy group in the US, whether there's.
Yeah, that's a good question. Environmental advocacy group. There isn't really a central coral reef advocacy group in terms of nonprofits. The group that's doing the most good is the Nature Conservancy, and they have a lot of money and they're doing a lot of good across the Caribbean. So if I was to pick a group that's most active in coral reef sciences, I would pick the Nature Conservancy, and their coral base, or their Caribbean base, I think is in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and they have a big outplanting operation going on down there where they're training people from other islands. They bring them in, they train them how to do fragmentation, and so the idea is to empower a Caribbean-wide cadre of coral reef applied scientists who are making a difference in their local spots. And I think the Nature Conservancy is a great group anyway. And I say that after not getting 2 jobs with them. Twice in my life, I've interviewed with them and been the finalist and then not been offered the job. So I do sometimes think like, Nature Conservancy. I'm not, it's fine. I like the job I have. I'm glad I didn't get those jobs. And they do great work. So I'm not going to say anything bad about them, but maybe I'll be third time lucky if I ever try for another job there. So.
Let's see, we've got one. Do nudibranchs have any signaling or flag waving info on coral reef reactions to problems? And how are they impacted by these conditions that are impacting the coral reefs? So nudibranchs specifically.
Yeah, nudibranchs. Boy, that's a great question. I have no idea. But I do know that nudibranchs are a sea of astounding chemicals. They're really bright for one thing, and they're bright because they're producing really toxic compounds, allelopathic compounds. And that's an interesting question. How do these organisms that produce these internal toxic compounds respond when the external chemistry of the ocean is changed? I think that's your question. And I guess I would say, like, that's a super interesting question. And if I was in my professor mode, I would say, how would you go about answering that? Because I have no idea. That's an interesting question. Nudibranchs are great. I've taken pictures of them, and I have no idea how they respond physiologically, internally. Interesting question. I do have a pretty good sense for how the internal physiology and phytochemistry of the symbionts responds. That's a field I work in, and I've done a fair amount of testing of the pigment expression and the genetic and protein expression of those symbionts. And so I might be able to come up with some ways you would look into that, but I've never done that on nudibranchs. But they are very cool.
Okay, thoughtful answer. Let's do one more here, and. Kevin says, excellent presentation and thank you for your years of research. Are there hopes of coral reef adaptation to some of the harms that we are inflicting?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question, and that's a giant field of research that I have not yet in my career been involved with. And the field of research that I'm talking about is called assisted evolution. And there are what this means is let's understand the stress in corals molecularly. Let's look at their genome and let's change their genome to enhance their ability to deal with that stress. There are 2 big researchers in this. One guy is named Steve Palumbi at Stanford, and another woman who unfortunately has just passed away was at the Coconut Island Research Station in Hawaii, named Dr. Ruth Gates. And they were the leaders in looking at this question, not only of how do these corals respond to heat stress, which lots of researchers around the world are looking at, but then taking the next step to say, can we possibly select or even genetically engineer a super coral that would be able to withstand the conditions that we've imposed and be able to rebuild a reef from that. And that is brave new world kind of stuff. I would be interested in working in a field like that. but I've only been involved on the edges of it. So I don't know about the moral and ethical questions that raises biologically. And if that's going to happen anywhere, one place where it should happen is the Caribbean, because the Caribbean was dominated by what are called the acroporid species, the branching species. If you can still see my screen, it's these species right here, the long branching ones that look like elk horn or deer horn. And this is actually an acroporid up here too, this spreading platform. Those acroporids accounted for upwards of 50% of the habitat creation in the Caribbean basin, and there's only 2 species. Unlike the Pacific, which is incredibly species rich, the Caribbean, for evolutionary reasons, only had 2 species of acroporids, and they're 99% gone. Like if you could devise a next generation Acropora palmata or Acropora cervicornis that fulfilled the ecosystem function and yet could live in 2-degree warmer water, you know, that would be something. And that would potentially be able to rebuild the Caribbean ecosystem as we used to know it. Or would it, would be the question I would ask. And the story of introductions in ecological meddling is you know, really long and rich. If anyone here has never seen the movie about the introduction of the cane toad to Queensland, you should watch it. It's I think one of the best nature movies ever made. Plus, it's just like bizarrely fabulous from a cultural standpoint. I say that as someone who lived in Queensland. What is it called now? It's called cane toads. Called cane toads, and it's about the introduction of cane toads to Queensland, and it's for free. You can watch it free on Vimeo, I think. So it's a great watch in a long evening. And that it's a cautionary tale though about how things can go wrong. And there are plenty of other introduction stories where things went wrong. But I think we are on the edge of that technologically, where we will be able to enter into the brave new world of genetically engineered coral reefs. And my experience working on the edges of molecular science in terms of phytoplankton is, if we can do it, there's someone's going to do it. And there, you know, someone in California or at MIT is going to do it if we can do it. And so it's not that far off.
Well, that's an optimistic way to end here, and you never disappoint, man. You've left us with
pessimistic all at the same time.
Yeah, right. Many more questions than what we started with, but that's just the way it should be. And thank you so much for taking the time to be here and really giving us a great education on this really important and rapidly changing subject.
Right. Well, thank you, and keep up the good conservation work down there as well. That's another great spot on the planet on Cape Cod. So
it sure is. Well,
thank you for hosting,
everyone, and thank you again, Ben.
Thank you.
Take care.